So there's this part in The Art Spirit, a book by Robert Henry, where he basically goes like, at a certain point, the palette and the brushes become the painter. And he says this because like sort of the way the colors mix on the palette and the way that the brushes and the bristles will, get a little bit withered over time, you know what I mean? They'll get a little bit stiff and all sporadic over time because of the way you use the brushes, because of the way you clean the brushes. He goes, these things will turn these just into the painter just as much. These will be markers of style one day as the artist themselves. First of all, shout out Robert Henry, because that's insane. Second of all, shout out to me. Due to my complete refusal to do anything that doesn't have bold colors, my colors have not been mixed too much. But on a more serious note, I do think there's something about this quote that's super interesting to me, something about this sentiment rather. And I think what I find so interesting about it is, in the same way that that's what happens with painting, I think that's also what happens in life. I made an observation really early on that like most of the older people in my life, by 40, were really upset about something. Maybe they weren't like, I hate my life. I'm very fortunate actually they grew up around a lot of people who are very content with their life. But I couldn't help but notice that like there was always something that they weren't happy with. They always wished there was something a little bit different. For a lot of these people, it was, I wish I did something different. I wish I went to college for a different thing. Some sort of big regret. Oftentimes it'll be tied to like money. I wish I was better off, and if I did this, I'd be better off now. But I think that looking at things now from where I am, especially, I'm somebody who is on the younger side, so I'm looking at the way I want my life to go as I progress and get older, and I'm like, I think the reason why all these people are sad with their life is because the colors on their metaphorical palette have been mixed in this certain way where the palette is painting more than they are. I think slowly over time, as you enrich your own life, you add colors to this metaphorical palette. I'm just going to call it a palette from this point forward, because I think me saying your metaphorical palette will be a mouthful for this whole episode. But I think as you go through life, you sort of add colors to your palette, right? I think, you go to college and you throw in maybe a little bit of red. You decide to marry somebody, you throw in a little bit of blue. You decide to go into a business, that blue and that blue and that red mix into a purple that's on your palette now. And then slowly colors get added that you don't want to have added. Maybe a recession hits, and because of that you have to sell off a bunch of things, or you have to close that business, and now there's a fat chunk of brown on the palette that you never wanted there because you don't like the color brown. And then maybe you accidentally, have another kid or something like that. Whatever happens in these people's lives that adds colors to their palette that they don't necessarily want there, right? And some of these things are very normal. I have some teal on this palette that I used one time that I'll never be using again, most likely, because teal is just not a color I paint with very often. And that's fine, it's okay, because maybe having that second accidental kid, or that first accidental kid that you never wanted, is that white adds a ton of color to your palette that you love now. It adds a degree of brightness. Now you really like that, right? But then there's some places in which, that brown that's on your palette from your business closing isn't really what you wanted, and now it's muddying up all the other colors, and it's like, now the marriage seems worse. Now this is bad. Now that's bad, right? Slowly over time, I think these things happen in what I believe to be a fairly natural way. I think part of this we just can't control, genuinely. And in the same way that I've talked about, like, sort of people end up living the life that everybody else wants because the forces of the world slowly pull things apart, I do think that, like, the forces of the world slowly paint a picture for people, and they... we live in a free world nowadays, and the fact that we don't have kings or anything like we used to. But we also live in like a deeply unfree world, I think, because of how little we actually get to decide about our own lives. By 20, all of our parents faced an intense economic pressure that led them to go to college. Maybe they never wanted to do that. You know, like all these things that are perceived as freedoms and virtues of the modern world also have an edge to them of like, you know, it's not really like we're in the freest time ever, you know? And I don't mean that in terms of like, you know, I'm not saying this out of me trying to make some sort of half-baked metaphorical political statement. I'm saying it just in terms of like, there's so much that you need to please in the world around you that unless you genuinely don't care what anybody else thinks about you ever, unless you genuinely, you know, are okay with being poor or any of these things, you don't truly get to customize your life. And in some ways, you gotta let people put other colors in the palette because that's the only way to live. You know, like it's like, for me to try and live a life that I have an absolute degree of control over, I would guess is just impossible. I mean, listen, maybe I'll be able to pull that off. I think we all try to pull that off, right? I think very few people go into life being like, I'm just gonna chill and do whatever kind of comes my way. I think we all try and pull off a life where we're in control of everything going on. But I don't think that happens very often. I think that's natural. You know, I think in a lot of ways you're gonna have to just make a lot of compromises, and maybe you end up living a life that you never really wanted to live. And that's very sad. But, you know, I think the biggest question is like, what is the biggest question for me, rather, and just a complete, you know, making this just completely personal, is I'm like, how do I make it so I don't ever have to face, so I'm never looking back being like, I'm genuinely not living a life I want to live now. Because I do see so many people in the older generation that I've met over the years that are just objectively living a life they don't want to be in so many ways. And it's like, I think there's a temptation to be like money. Money's a solution. You know, if you just have enough money to do everything, you can just do whatever you want your way. Because money is freedom, right? That's how I look at it, at least. I mean, it's hard to live a life seeing people struggle with money and not think that after a while. You know, like money just is freedom in so many ways. So is that just the answer? But then, like, I also think that so many people are putting colors they don't want on their palette in pursuit of money, you know? I know 20 people that I can probably name off the top of my head that went to college to be a doctor who don't care about medicine at all. It's just gonna make them money. And they're like, I don't care, I just need money, so I'm gonna do this. And you know, there's the camp of people that go, you'd rather be broke and happy than sad and rich, but I can't say that it's hard to look at a bunch of people who are broke and sad and think that that's true. You know what I mean? So I do understand why so many people have this mindset of like, I'll just do whatever it takes to get as much money as possible and say, fuck everything else. I can't help but empathize with that position. And, you know, when it comes to this whole idea of like, other people are gonna add paints to your palette, other things are gonna come along that muddy all the colors, and you, like, is the goal at the end of the day, there's a temptation when I think about this stuff like this to be like, okay, I know this exists, I agree with this thing I'm thinking, what do I do about it? How do I prevent all these other colors from getting on my palette? And as much as I rack my brain for an answer to that question, I don't know if there is one. I think that the answer might genuinely just be, these colors are gonna come and get added because we live in the world we live in, and you know, that's gonna happen. A big example of this is like, the modern like administration that's in the Trump administration. I'm trying to find words to get around it because I never like talking about politics on the show. But the Trump administration's a huge example of this. I know so many people that are like deeply affected by what's going on right now, whether you like it or not. You know, like opinions about it aside, I just know people who are being affected by the things going on, and I can't help but be like, wow, what if you do everything right your whole life, and then just somebody gets into office it's so far from you, so far removed, but it deeply affects your life despite you guarding that palette so well, you know? Like, I can't help but think about that. And, like, I wonder, should you even try to protect it, you know? Because like, as much as I want to come here and be like, okay, what do you do about that now that I know that the palette's going to have other colors thrown onto it? The solution, the palette only exists to make paintings, you know? You don't just put paint on a palette for no reason. And I think maybe in my metaphor that I thought up before this recording, that's the big part of it that I missed, is that with a palette of brown, muddied paints, you can still make a beautiful portrait. And that's so hard to say, knowing how much lives can be affected by something that's not their fault. Like, it's really, like, that's the answer I want to think of here. Like, I want to be like, oh no, like, even if you get brown, muddied paints on your palette, you can still paint a beautiful portrait as long as there's some light there. You know, no matter what happens, there'll be days when you and your family are together, and those brown, muddy colors, you won't even be thinking about them because it's only that bright blue that you love on that palette that's in front of you right then. And I love that answer. And I think for somebody like me who lives in ostensibly, you know, globally speaking, an upper class lifestyle, you know, in comparison to not just in America, I'm like lower middle class probably. But in like the world, speaking of the world, like that's a great answer for somebody like me. And very likely many of the people watching this, you know. If you're somebody who is, whether you're anywhere in the middle to upper class in America, like that's an easy answer for you to have, to go like, you need to still just do your best. But like, I unfortunately don't think that's a viable answer for most of the people. And that's why I think that a lot of people always love the answer if you gotta change the hand that squeezes those colors onto the palette, you know? I don't know. I feel like this talk kind of lost me. But, hey, happens. I hope you guys still got something out of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is today's painting. It's a guy, yeah. I titled it Tomorrow. So I hope you guys like it. I actually think this is pretty cool. As I said, I've been blending a lot of reds lately, and this is more of that, so go check this out over on Instagram. And until next time, guys, gals, and pals, my name is Max Dice. This has been Paint and Talk, episode 107? Yeah, 107. Yeah, right? Yeah, this has been Paint and Talk, episode 107. I'm here every morning, painting and talking with you all.